both in the United States and in the NATO countries, there is this political disadvantage, and that we have to be responsive. Governments need to be responsive to their people, whereas Putin really doesn't, so far anyway. So a stalemated World War I type scenario dragging on for a year does raise that question about political support. So how do you assess, both in the United States and maybe if you could comment on our NATO allies, the sustainability of the political support?
Well, first of all, I agree with you, Bob, in that assessment. Remember, a month ago, however, people were wondering if Putin was facing huge internal political challenges at the time of the Prigozhin would-be coup or mutiny attempt, or call it what you will. And Putin survived that, and he survived it in a way that I'm not going to say it's going to make him stronger, but if Prigozhin can't do it, I don't know who could. And so in that regard, I think we have seen, unfortunately, a reaffirmation that Putin has so manipulated Russian politics that he's not going to be challenged in all likelihood by an internal revolt. And on top of that, I'm not sure that the Russian people are quite as fundamentally against this war as we like to think. And in fact, I think there are a lot of Russians who have at least partially bought the Putin propaganda that this is a response to Western encroachment, trying to bring Ukraine into NATO and the EU, but also trying to position NATO forces in such a way that they could threaten Russia. That's complete nonsense, of course, but doesn't stop the Russian propaganda machine from making that claim. So that's a long way of agreeing with your premise, but let me get to your question, which is, as you say, what's going to happen in Western countries, in our democracies? And I don't really think that anything is likely to fundamentally challenge our cohesion except next year's US presidential election, possibly. In other words, we've already seen shifts and turns and major political change in most of the big countries of Western Europe in the course of the Ukraine crisis and war, where we've seen one type of challenge or another, or an election cycle. I guess maybe not in France, but in most of the other countries, you've had a change of government or some kind of test of the political will of that people of that country in regard to this war effort, and they stood by it. And moreover, none of them is indispensable, except maybe Germany and Poland, I suppose, for their logistics positioning more than for their actual amounts of aid. Although, backing up your point again, Bob, the United States, yes, has committed about $80 billion in total assistance to Ukraine. The Europeans collectively have committed about $120 billion, because they have made a lot more in the way of financial and humanitarian grants or loans than we have. And you could say they shouldn't really count the loans, but I expect the loans to be forgiven someday. So I do think we should count them. And they've also paid close to $50 billion in refugee resettlement costs, which dwarf what we've done. And so the whole world together has given Ukraine over the last year and a half, $200 billion to $250 billion in one type or another of assistance. And that's a remarkable level. It does raise the question of how long will this be maintained? And I do think you could see a serious threat, not so much to the aid pipeline writ large or absolutely, but to the magnitude of how much we got it opened up. So I think you're right that the first order change after this summer of 2023 will be to give F-16s and ATACMS, and probably to therefore increase the quality and maybe even the quantity of military assistance. But by next year, even if Donald Trump does not win the presidency, even if Ron DeSantis does not win the presidency, I think you'll have a lot of Democrats and moderate Republicans asking, how long can and should we do this if all we're doing is essentially reinforcing stalemate? It's not reinforcing failure, but reinforcing stalemate. And doesn't it make sense at some point to say to President Zelensky, God bless you, we love you, the Russians have stolen your land, you should get it back, but you're not going to be able to get it all back on the battlefield. We're going to have to at some point accept ceasefire lines, and we're going to have to let this be a long-term political project, to wait perhaps for a new leader in the Kremlin, for maybe it's 20, 30-year project. And the world will never forget that the Crimea region, that the Donbas region and the areas between are Ukrainian, and we will never rest. Our successors will never rest until we get that land back. And we can't promise you if or when we'll get it all back, but it's not going to be on the battlefield. You're going to have to accept a strategy that acknowledges that. That is the debate that I expect to happen next year. I don't necessarily know how to predict its resolution. I don't know that we will, in fact, force Zelensky to scale back his battlefield goals. But I think a lot of people in the United States and other parts of NATO will start making that argument. We'll start wondering if that argument is correct. And at that point, it could go either way, not because we're going to abandon Ukraine, but because we may decide that it's time to essentially use our leverage to force them to scale back their military ambitions.